They said she wasn't worth saving. An alien girl with glowing skin, left outside a hospital like discarded waste. The doctors ran their calculations, and the numbers condemned her. But then, a human man stopped. Not a soldier. Not a hero. Just a tired technician heading home after another long shift. And that single moment, one man choosing to care, ignited a chain of events that would defy biology, cross galaxies, and create something the universe had never seen before. This is not just a love story. It is a story about what happens when we stop accepting what is efficient, and start believing in what is right. Follow me to the end of the story, something will make your heart flutter. Eli walked into the night, carrying something fragile, something dying, something not of his world, and he knew without question that whatever happened next, his life had just split into two paths, the one he had known, and the one that began with a single impossible decision, to care when no one else would. The city did not notice, the streets remained indifferent, sky rails hummed above him as transport pods zipped by like silent predators, their magnetic suspensions whispering ghost-thin songs to the towers that pierced the clouds. A billboard blinked overhead, "Tomorrow Heals" in 46 languages, its animation looping seamlessly, a human child and a robotic caregiver smiling beneath a crescent sky. Eli glanced at it, bitterly amused. Tomorrow healed, maybe, but tonight bled. She stirred slightly in his arms, her skin so faintly translucent shimmered in response to his body heat, not in a natural way, not like blood rushing to the surface, but like circuitry warming under a voltage surge. Her eyelids fluttered, as if she were dreaming of a world less cruel. He ducked into a maintenance tunnel, one of the old bypass corridors from the city's earlier expansion phase. The lights in here flickered and sputtered, some permanently dimmed to save energy credits. The hum of traffic above was muffled to a dull pulse, and here, the world felt older, more honest, less curated. Almost there, he whispered, more to reassure himself than her. She didn't respond. Her breathing remained slow, shallow, but present, and that fragile rhythm had become his anchor. Every breath she drew kept him from questioning the absurdity of his choice. Eli's apartment wasn't much, a steel slab of a room embedded in a stack of living modules along the 42nd strata. The door recognized his bias sign and hissed open, stale air greeting him like a dog too long ignored. He laid her gently on the single sleep cot, brushing aside the remnants of his last ration, half a nutrition bar, unopened. The glow from her body painted faint constellations across his walls. He watched, hypnotized. It wasn't just light, it shifted, symbols emerged and vanished, as if her skin was a canvas where forgotten languages tried to write themselves. He pulled his analog radio closer. Digital systems could be tracked, but the radio, scavenged from a Terran wreckage and lovingly restored, was stubbornly silent until he twisted the tuning dial to a specific, unauthorized band. A voice answered on the other end, grainy but unmistakably real. "Draven. I found something," he said. "Someone." Silence followed. Then, "Human." "No. Left to die outside the Nexus." A sigh. "You really need to stop walking into trouble like it's a second home. Can you come?" "I'll try. But Eli, you know what this could mean." "I know." He turned off the signal. If they tracked the frequency, it wouldn't matter now, he was in too deep. The girl stirred again, her eyes opened slowly, not in panic but as though awakening from centuries of exile. She stared at the ceiling, blinking slowly. Her fingers moved across the thin blanket as if testing its texture, as if reminding herself this moment was real. Eli crouched beside her. "What's your name?" A pause, her lips moved with effort. "Kaelira." It sounded like a memory disguised as a song. "I'm Eli," he offered. "You're safe here." Another pause. "Safe doesn't mean the same thing to me anymore." He didn't press, he simply nodded. After a moment, he stood and moved to the kitchenette. Water, she needed water. As he poured a small cup, he noticed something odd on the counter, a faint smudge of light, moving like a ripple across the surface. It vanished when he touched it. Static, projection, or something leaking from her presence. He returned to her side. She accepted the water, sipping carefully, Her throat contracted with difficulty, but she didn't choke. Eli watched the way her fingers held the cup, not shaky but deliberate, like a dancer relearning choreography. "What are you?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted to T. The apartment was not much, a small corner unit wedged into the upper rim of a pre-collapse maintenance tower, but it had real walls made of brick, a window that barely opened, and a kind of mechanical warmth born of clutter and wear, not design. Eli carried her up the 6 flights of emergency stairs, his arms trembling not from her weight but from the growing awareness that whatever she was, whatever had been done to her, this was no longer a matter of accident or impulse. He laid her gently on the old leather couch, the springs creaking with complaint, and watched as her body settled into the fabric, her limbs folding inward as if she were still preparing to be discarded. The light from her skin had dimmed to a soft pulse, irregular, like a warning beacon losing signal. He moved through the space automatically, fetching the thermal blanket he kept for cold nights, a bottle of distilled water, and the small emergency medkit he never expected to use. She flinched slightly as the blanket touched her, not in fear but in confusion, as if the concept of comfort were foreign. The silence between them was vast, stretched thin by unanswered questions and fragile breath. Eli sat on the floor beside the couch, arms draped loosely over his knees, and waited. Eventually, her eyes fluttered open again, not fully alert but aware enough to focus on him. He didn't ask the obvious things, not yet. Instead he offered her the water, which she accepted with trembling hands, sipping it like someone who had forgotten what it meant to be nourished. Her voice came at last, low and fractured, shaped by an accent he couldn't place, as if her throat had not been meant to speak his language but did so out of necessity. "I am called Kaelira." He nodded slowly, the name foreign and beautiful, like wind over ice. "Where are you from?" he asked, not expecting an answer. She blinked, a slow motion that seemed more like hesitation than thought. "The Outer Crescent," she said, her voice barely audible, second orbit colony near the Glia's convergence. He had heard of it, a distant arc of semi-terraformed moons, most known for their mineral exports and unstable politics. Nothing there was supposed to be permanent, not the settlements, not the people. Her fingers traced the edge of the blanket absent-mindedly, like she was cataloging its texture for future reference. "They said I was defective," she whispered, not looking at him. "My energy is unstable, dangerous, uncorrectable." Eli frowned, leaning closer. "What kind of energy?" "Bioluminal resonance," she replied, a term he had only encountered once in a tech journal he half remembered, a phenomenon where living tissue generates and modulates light based on metabolic and emotional fluctuations, rare and poorly understood, mostly observed in deep-sea creatures or certain biogenic xenoforms. Kaelira continued, her voice growing steadier as if the telling itself gave her structure. "When I was born, the resonance was misaligned, incomplete. I have episodes. My light becomes chaotic. It destabilizes everything near me, machines, people, systems. They said it couldn't be cured, only contained." Eli exhaled slowly. "And the Nexus just abandoned you?" Her gaze met his, and in it was the quiet fury of someone who had stopped expecting justice long ago. "They calculated that stabilizing me would exceed the value I could return to society. Their algorithm determined I was unsustainable." It wasn't said with bitterness, only fact, like reciting a weather report after the storm has already passed. He stood and paced the room, his mind grasping for traction. He had worked alongside Virellians, the species that operated the Nexus. He had seen their flawless efficiency, their commitment to calculated outcomes, but never this, not abandonment, not in the open. He looked down at her, this glowing remnant of a decision made by numbers and policies and people who had never seen her eyes. "What about your people, your family?" Kaelira's expression shifted, her light flickering once in a pale ripple across her collarbone. "Gone," she said simply. The city changed before dawn, its shadows sharpening into cold definition as the upper vents released controlled bursts of atmospheric vapor to simulate sunrise, a lie told through light and timing, but still believed by those too tired to question it, the illusion of dawn serving more as regulation than renewal, casting a filtered glow across ferrocrete towers and silent roadways that no longer remembered the sound of birds. Eli Draven moved quickly through the maintenance corridors of the old quarter, Kaelira wrapped in his arms beneath the oversized thermal cloak, her faint luminescence concealed beneath layers of dull cloth, her breath steady but thin, and though his steps were brisk, there was a careful rhythm to them, the way one moves through a temple or a tomb, respectful of what lies inside. The few others who crossed their path, janitors, cargo lifters, night cycle vendors, gave them no more than a glance, and in Seraphon 9 that was a form of mercy, for curiosity was a luxury rarely exercised in the early hours, when the city's facade slipped and showed its tired machinery underneath. He followed the old pathways, tunnels that once fed coolant and data to the city's deeper structures but were now used only by those who didn't want to be seen, spaces long abandoned by regulations but kept alive by necessity and rumor. Tarnoke did not keep a clinic in any registered sense, his presence tolerated rather than approved, a known eccentric whose usefulness had outlived the discomfort his species caused, and even those who feared him whispered his name in reverence when systems failed or bodies broke where sanctioned medicine refused to reach. The entrance was located behind a derelict Malift station, a metal hatch marked by a single glyph that glowed faintly with bioluminescent paint, illegible to most but unmistakable to those who knew, a symbol half-woven from organic script and machine logic. Eli tapped the panel beside it twice, paused, then once more, and a sharp mechanical click responded. The door opened with a hiss of negative pressure, revealing a narrow passage lit by pulsing amber strips embedded in the walls, and he stepped inside, the hatch sealing behind him like a vault closing on the world above. The air grew warmer, saturated with a faint mineral scent and something deeper, like ozone after lightning, tinged with biological undertones that made the skin prickle but not retreat. Kaelira stirred slightly in his arms but did not wake, her body limp but not lifeless, and Eli adjusted his grip as he descended the sloped corridor, the light dancing along the seams of her skin in brief, unstable flares. The corridor opened into a chamber that defied easy description, part laboratory, part greenhouse, part habitat, its walls curved organically, lined with tanks of phosphorescent organisms and suspended life forms that pulsed in rhythm with invisible currents, and the air felt alive, as if the chamber itself were breathing. In the center, surrounded by what looked like a mobile surgical array built from repurposed farming equipment and drone scaffolding, stood Tarnoke. Nearly 2 meters tall and covered in segmented armor the color of oxidized copper, the Arcane physician resembled a humanoid scorpion, 4 jointed arms ending in dexterous claws, his long tail coiled above his back like a sentinel antenna, unmoving but alert. His face was dominated by 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern, each reflecting a different wavelength of light, and beneath them, mandibles twitched with curiosity rather than threat, the kind of alien calculation that had no malice but no mercy either. Tarnoke, Eli called softly. I need your help. The creature turned, his topmost eyes narrowing, then widening with what Eli recognized as surprise, a rare reaction for a being so accustomed to broken things. This is unexpected. The voice that emerged from his vocal translator was deep and resonant, layered with harmonics designed to put mammals at ease, though the effect was more disconcerting than comforting. You bring me a bioluminal WI. The hum of Tarnoke's machines was the only sound in the chamber as Eli stood watching the slow undulation of light beneath Kaelira's skin, her body still, suspended within a cocoon of resonance fields and stabilizing waveforms, each pulse a fragile argument against entropy, a soft rebellion against silence. The Arcane moved silently across his instruments, 4 limbs working in concert, claws tapping and adjusting values on translucent panels that shifted with every second, their displays alive with alien script and pulsing graphs that defied human intuition, symbols that seemed to change shape when looked at too long, as though reality itself hesitated to define them. Tarnoke's tail flicked in agitation, the gesture subtle but unmistakable, and Eli knew something in the scan data was troubling him, though he dared not ask yet, choosing instead to listen, to watch, to let the room reveal its truth. The physician didn't speak for several minutes, instead narrowing all 4 of his eyes on the display before him as if he could will the numbers to obey a logic that did not yet exist, as though somewhere within the shifting data was a path, narrow and treacherous, but possible. At last, he stepped back and turned toward Eli, mandibles twitching in what resembled concern, though Arakeans rarely admitted to such emotions openly. It is worse than I thought, he said, his voice resonant and low, the harmonics more subdued now, more weighted. She is not simply misaligned. Her condition is the result of a rare disorder among bioluminal species, known as crystalline phase divergence. Eli frowned, the words unfamiliar, heavy with meaning he could feel but not yet grasp. What does that mean? Tarnok gestured to the projection hovering above Kaelira's chest, an intricate pattern of light that shimmered like frozen flame, moving with a grace that was both beautiful and unstable. Within her, he said, her bioluminal matrix contains crystalline structures formed during early metabolic development. These structures are meant to regulate energy flow, to harmonize the body's inner resonance with external stimuli. But in her case, the alignment is incomplete, fragmented. The crystalline nodes do not synchronize. They interfere. That interference causes energy to build up, Eli said slowly, remembering the erratic glow, the pulses that made the air itself feel unstable. Exactly. It creates feedback loops between her nervous system and the light-producing cells, Tarnok replied. That energy has nowhere to go. The system begins to collapse. Her mind, her body, her sense of self, all unravel under the strain. Can it be fixed? Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper, not because he feared the answer, but because he feared hope. Tarnok hesitated. Not with standard medical procedures. Not with drugs or surgery. Her condition requires molecular realignment at the source. A recalibration of the crystal resonance. And there is only one known compound that can do that, a bioluminescent moss found only on the oceanic vents of Voluna 3. Voluna 3, Eli repeated, the name stirring a memory, a distant moon orbiting a gas giant beyond the inner systems, known among technicians and smugglers for its volatile oceans and lethal cold. I've heard stories, pressure fields, corrosive currents, monsters the size of fusion tanks. Tarnok's eyes gleamed. Most of those stories are exaggerated, but not by much. The moss grows near thermal vents 3,000 meters beneath the surface. The environment is unstable, the fauna aggressive, and the site is classified under restricted biogenic zones. Which means it's illegal to harvest. Tarnok's mandibles twitched again. Only without the proper permits, which take months to obtain and are almost never granted to independent civilians. So we do it without them, Eli said. We find another way. Tarnok inclined his head. There is a research outpost operating off the grid on Voluna 3's southern trench. Its lead scientist is a human xenobotanist named Mara Halden. She owes me a favor from a long time ago. If anyone has access to the MOS. The alert came just past third cycle, when the sky above Seraphon 9 dimmed into that pretense of twilight meant to coax nocturnal workers into rest, and Eli Draven knew instantly that something had shifted. The air tasted different, more metallic, as if the city had begun to bleed through its own circuits, a thin film of static seeming to crawl across the walls, subtle but inescapable, like a breath held too long. Tarnok's COMM line flared with a burst of static, then resolved into the clipped voice of an anonymous source embedded in the hospital grid. Unauthorized removal of subject Kaelira Delta 47, the voice announced. Violation of treatment directive. Status upgraded to quarantine breach. Enforcement mobilized. Eli stood frozen for a heartbeat, then turned to where Kaelira lay resting beneath a low hum of stabilizer fields. Her glow had steadied, a rhythmic pulse of pale cyan under the skin, no longer frantic, no longer fading. She looked almost peaceful, as if her body had finally remembered how to exist in the quiet, but the peace would not last. Tarnok was already moving, pulling a case from beneath the moss-draped table, his claws moving in swift patterns of urgency. You must leave now, he said, his voice stripped of preamble. The Virellian Health Authority has activated tracking protocols. They will triangulate her light signature. You have perhaps 10 minutes before they breach this level. Eli nodded once, already reaching for his coat. Is there another way out? Tarnok pressed a sequence on a recessed panel, revealing a narrow corridor veiled behind bioluminescent growth. It leads to the reactor maintenance spine. Dangerous but unmonitored. Eli knelt beside Kaelira, touching her shoulder gently. Her eyes opened slowly, searching his face, and in the silence that followed, the moment hung like a breath unspoken. "You were glowing," he whispered. "Too bright for them to ignore. They are coming. We need to move." She blinked once, then sat up with effort, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, her glow dimming instinctively as fear overtook her breath. "I don't want to go back," she said softly. "You won't?" he replied, helping her to her feet. Tarnok handed him a thermal injector and a small data node. "The dose will keep her stable for 6 hours. Use the node to contact Captain Hardy. His vessel is docked in Bay 9 under the name Auric Drift. He owes me 2 favors and a debt of honor." Eli nodded, gripping the vial and the node tightly. Tarnok's upper eyes narrowed. "And Eli, do not hesitate. They will not take her alive." The corridor was narrow and hot, lined with cracked insulation and humming conduit, barely wide enough for 2. They moved quickly, Eli leading, Kaelira close behind, her movements slower but growing steadier as the temporary stabilizer began to harmonize her rhythm. Every few steps, she would look over her shoulder as if expecting the darkness behind them to exhale teeth. The city's heartbeat followed them, pulses of electrical surge echoing through the walls like some ancient predator drawing breath. The lights above flickered in a slow rhythm, not broken but interrogative, as if the city were blinking in suspicion. They emerged into the lower utility tunnels, a labyrinth of collapsed scaffolding and forgotten railways, long since buried beneath newer constructs, ducts now repurposed by scavengers and those who no longer trusted official passageways. Eli knew these paths. He had worked them before the central regulators were upgraded, back when humans still climbed into dead metal to fix things with their hands. They moved in silence, the only sounds their footfalls and the occasional flicker of Kaelira's light against the wet walls. Her skin had cooled but still shimmered faintly, impossible to erase completely. At last, they reached a vertical lift shaft, the kind long abandoned by transit authorities but occasionally used by smugglers and scavengers. Eli activated the manual crank, the old cage rattling as it descended into position. "Get in," he said, helping Kaelira through the opening. "The ride W.A." The Auric Drift rose from the docks of Seraphon 9 without ceremony, without clearance, and without the weight of regret. It moved like a ghost pressed between layers of radiation and silence, its hull lined with sensor-blind alloy and forgotten codes from wars long past, every surface etched with stories no one bothered to read anymore. Inside, the pressure shifted as the artificial gravity stabilized, a hum running through the deck like a memory trying to return, familiar yet unreachable, the echo of something once human-made mechanical by survival. Captain Hardy sat at the helm, his hands steady on the old analog flight controls, his eyes hidden beneath a visor flickering with encrypted flight paths and counter-surveillance filters, his breath slow and methodical as though his lungs had long since learned to match the rhythm of engines. The stars outside the cockpit blurred into amber streaks as they breached the edge of atmosphere, and the weight of the world below them finally broke apart into the quiet vastness of space. Eli stood behind the captain, one hand braced on the rail, his breath still catching in fragments, not from fear, but from the realization that they had made it, that they were no longer running beneath towers and alarms but sailing through a place where no one could hear a name whispered into extinction. Kaelira sat strapped into the seat beside him, her glow barely visible under layers of fabric, her pulse slow, but stable, her skin pale but steady, her presence no longer fading into entropy. The stabilizer was holding. For now. Hardy flicked a switch and the NAV screen unfolded like an electric map of old constellations and new lies, routes carved into blackness by ships long dead and trade agreements already forgotten. "We'll take the merchant corridor to the Callisto Gate," he said. "Cut across Jupiter's shadow and bleed into Valuna from the backside. Slow, but quiet." Eli nodded. "We're not running anymore," he said. "Just reaching." Hardy gave a grunt that could have meant anything. The ship rumbled as the thrusters adjusted course, then settled into a silence so deep it felt like breathing beneath water, a hush that neither soothed nor warned, only waited. "You two picked the wrong kind of trouble," Hardy muttered. "The Virellians don't chase like cops. They pursue like mathematics. Cold. Predictable. Merciless. I know, Eli replied. That's why I brought her to someone who doesn't believe in formulas. Hardy let out a dry laugh. Tarnok still brooding in his fungal cave. Some things never change. He saved her life, Eli said. He may save it again. Hardy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you know I was there on Voluna once. During the reclamation. Saw the oceans light up from the inside. Glacial tides that glow like breathing glass. Beautiful. But full of teeth. He glanced at Kaelira without turning. You ready to walk into a place that doesn't want you? Her voice was soft, calm. I have walked through cities that pretended I didn't exist. This is no different. Hardy gave a small nod, almost respectful. The next few hours passed in the low rhythm of space flight, engines vibrating gently through the floor, systems breathing like lungs older than any one crew. Eli sat with Kaelira in the cargo bay, where storage crates hummed with regulated warmth and the artificial gravity pulsed in a slow lull, the kind of rhythm designed to trick tired minds into sleep. She leaned against him, silent, her eyes closed, her light gently pulsing along her arms in silent conversation with the systems around her, as if they were listening and responding in a language too slow for human understanding. What are you feeling? He asked. Like I am beginning, she said. Not stable. Not safe. But beginning. Eli hesitated. You never asked me why I helped you. She opened her eyes, not surprised by the question. I don't need to ask. You do not help because of questions. You help because of answers you already live by. That's a dangerous way to move through the galaxy, Eli said. It gets people killed. Her fingers touched his. And it also. The descent into Voluna 3 was slow, deliberate, and oddly quiet, as though the planet itself resisted intrusion with a kind of frozen dignity. The auric drift pierced through layers of glacial clouds and ultraviolet mist, its sensors painting an outline of the icy surface broken only by the faint pulse of artificial heat signatures. Somewhere far below, beneath ice thick enough to hide oceans, the research station waited, but before they could begin the final approach, the ship settled into a low stationary orbit and the engines shifted to standby. Hardy left them with a brief warning not to trust gravity, or silence, and then disappeared into the cockpit. Eli and Kaelira sat together in the auxiliary chamber just behind the cargo bay, a narrow space meant for storing environmental suits and decompression gear, now bathed in soft yellow lighting and a hum that made Eli think of hibernation chambers in old colony vessels. Kaelira leaned against the wall, her breathing slow, her glow steadier now than it had been in days, but still not quite stable. He watched her, not with anxiety, but with something stranger, a quiet attention drawn not from worry but from gravity, as though her very presence shaped the way the air moved. She spoke first, her voice quiet, as if testing it against the hush of the room. Do you feel it? She asked. Eli tilted his head. Feel what? This space between us, she whispered. It has changed. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing his, and something passed through the contact like a low harmonic, not pain, not warmth, but a subtle pressure that wrapped around his pulse and made it throb slightly slower. Eli froze, then looked down at their hands. Her light shimmered beneath her skin, curling around his touch in pale spirals, and his own skin responded, not visibly, but internally, like a shift in electrical field. I feel it, he said. But what is it? Resonance, Kaelira said. My kind are born with light signatures, but they rarely align with others. When they do, the result is amplification. Sometimes healing. Sometimes more. Eli studied her face. You're saying we're aligned. I'm saying your energy doesn't disrupt mine, she said. It joins it. She closed her eyes for a moment, and Eli felt a gentle pulse where their fingers touched, a rhythm he couldn't name but instinctively matched. My system is usually chaotic, she said. Always trying to regulate, always in conflict. But when you're near, the storm softens. She opened her eyes. I think it's doing the same to you. Eli hesitated, then nodded slowly. I've been running on high-frequency adrenaline since the day I pulled you from that alley, but right now, I feel like I could breathe without counting the seconds." Kaelira smiled, and in that moment her glow brightened slightly, the pattern smoothing into a soft helix that spun gently across her collarbone and faded into her throat. Eli reached out and placed his palm lightly over the center of her chest, where the light was strongest, where the pulse seemed to emerge. The contact was electric but not jarring, a subtle charge that flowed into his fingers and made him inhale without meaning to. She did not pull away. Their breaths synchronized slowly, the space between them narrowing, not physically, but in some other field they could not name. "When I was a child," she said, "my mother told me that resonance between living beings was the rarest form of stability. She said it was a bond stronger than biology, something built from shared frequencies of survival." Eli said nothing. He could feel her heartbeat now, not through his ears, but through his own pulse, as though their rhythms had found a common thread and followed it down. The glow beneath her skin brightened again, and this time it reached beyond her body, casting a faint luminescence into the room that flickered against the walls like bioluminescent algae under motion. "What are we doing?" he asked softly. She looked at him, and her eyes were steady. "We are healing each other." The idea sounded impossible, but his bones accepted it before his mind. The submersible groaned as it descended into the glacial fissure, the sound of metal adjusting to pressure like bones remembering ancient weight. Eli sat strapped into the narrow cockpit, his breath steady but shallow, his fingers clenched around the controls not from fear, but from the knowledge that nothing about this was supposed to work. Outside, the ice walls pressed inward in slow undulating spirals, glowing faintly from thermal stress, illuminated by the vessel's frontal beams which sliced the dark with thin silver lines. Voluna 3's ocean was not a place meant for human presence. It was ancient, pressurized beyond tolerance, laced with chemical currents that stripped synthetic hulls clean within hours, home to bioluminescent ecosystems that operated on wavelengths still not catalogued by Earth science. The submersible was not built for combat, or even exploration. It was an old research pod with outdated shielding and barely functioning depth stabilizers. But Hardy had modified it, reinforced the hull with salvaged titanium filaments and patched the interior life support system using parts scavenged from orbital mining rigs. It would hold. Probably. Above him, Agar Station grew smaller in the display, the surface vanishing beneath a veil of ice that thickened with every meter. Hardy's voice crackled over the COMM. "Still reading you. Depth at 600 meters. All seals holding. You've got about 30 minutes before the pressure begins to outpace the thermal regulators." "Copy that," Eli replied. "What's Kaelira's status?" "She's awake," Hardy said. "Calm. Watching your vitals like she can see through them." "She can," Eli murmured. "Probably better than the sensors." As the descent continued, the ice gave way to open water, dark and endless. Particulate drift shimmered like dust in starlight, and strange tendrils of light pulsed in the distance, slow and rhythmic, like the breathing of a sleeping beast. The thermal vents lay in a trench known only as the Crosshead, a jagged scar at the bottom of Voluna 3's southern hemisphere, where the moon's core still exhaled heat into the frozen sea. The algae grew in the mineral-rich plumes around those vents, feeding off the impossible blend of temperature, pressure, and time. Tarnok's instructions were clear. Gather the moss in its active state. Avoid exposure to unfiltered vent gas. Do not let the bioluminescent predators sense your body heat. Easy. Eli adjusted the vector thrusters and guided the pod toward the trench. The descent angle steepened. At 1200 meters, the light from the surface was gone. The only illumination now came from the vessel's own beams and the occasional flicker of organic light from the depths. He passed by a field of massive tubular organisms, their bodies hollow and swaying, light blooming in soft pulses along their sides like coded language. They shimmered in ways that almost formed patterns, as if they were watching him, testing his presence, whispering through glow. At 1500 meters, the pressure began to bite. The hull moaned, not from weakness, but from acknowledgement. He felt it in his teeth, a low vibration that crept up his spine and whispered about mortality. Then the trench appeared. A black wound in the ocean floor, white and fractured, heat venting in curling columns of superheated minerals that danced in the water like living smoke. The moss glowed faintly along the edges of the vents, clusters of pale blue and green shapes clinging to the basalt, swaying gently in the current like the strands of a forgotten prayer. Eli maneuvered the pod closer, stabilizing just above the edge. He activated the collection arm, a telescoping claw fitted with a thermal sheath and pressure-sensitive retrieval container. Slowly, carefully, he extended the arm toward the nearest cluster. The moment the claw touched the moss, the lights around him shifted. Not in the pod. In the water. A dozen glows flared into being in the distance, moving with synchronized pulses, closing fast. Predators. He didn't know what they were, only that Hardy's warning. The return to Seraphon 9 was quieter than expected, as if the stars themselves had paused to acknowledge the weight of what they carried, and the Auric drift docked at an old freight terminal far from the regulated zones, its engines sighing into silence while the hull cooled under layers of industrial shadow, and Tarnok was waiting, his four eyes glinting in the low light, his claws folded against his chest as he watched them descend from the ramp, and Kaelira moved slower than before, but steadier, her light no longer flickering with chaos but flowing in soft cycles that seemed to echo the rhythm of breath, every motion deliberate, as though her body now moved not only for herself but for something new coalescing quietly within, and Eli walked beside her with a sample case secured in one hand, his eyes drawn constantly to the way her presence touched the world around her, not just illuminating but altering, like the fabric of Seraphon 9 itself had grown aware of her, of what she was becoming, and Tarnok said nothing at first, only turned without greeting and led them into the hidden clinic beneath the surface, past walls of damp moss and whispering machines, through dim tunnels humming with old codes and forgotten data, until they reached the resonance chamber, where Kaelira stood in the center while Tarnok activated a diagnostic array that pulsed light across her skin, scanning frequencies beyond human hearing, and the readings shifted, curved, then spiked, and Tarnok tilted his head and muttered that the moss was integrating faster than predicted, that her crystalline phase was stabilizing, and Eli exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest loosening for the first time in days, and asked if she was going to survive, to which Tarnok replied more than survive, and turned one of his eyes toward Eli and said she was transforming, and Kaelira's gaze did not falter as she said she could feel it, but that was not all, and asked if there was more, and Tarnok adjusted a spectral field projector and narrowed the scan radius until the chamber filled with soft blue light, and then it pulsed again, and a second field appeared within the first, smaller, distinct, resonating not with chaos but with harmony, and Tarnok stepped back and said it could not be, and Eli's breath caught as he asked what that was, and Tarnok's mandibles clicked softly as he identified a secondary resonance field, separate but dependent, originating within the core of her energy matrix. And then he looked directly at them and said she was carrying a new frequency, a life form, and Eli stared at the projection, at a heartbeat, a spiral of energy, small, incomplete, but real, and said, "You're saying she's pregnant? That's not possible, our species are not biologically compatible," and Tarnok nodded slowly and said that was the assumption, and yet here we are, and Kaelira reached for Eli's hand, her skin warm beneath the light, and said she felt it begin in the chamber on the ship, when their fields aligned, that there was something different, something that did not belong to either of them but came from both, and Eli shook his head in wonder and asked how, and Tarnok closed his interface and let the projection fade and said he could only speculate, that the resonance bond had stabilized her condition beyond chemical means and had rewritten her matrix, that Eli's energy signature had merged with hers at a depth he had never observed, and in doing so had created a new harmonic, and within that harmony something began to grow, a bridge between their forms, and it may not have begun in the physical sense, but in the language of energy, of vibration, and once the blueprint was written, the body followed, and this was not conception, it was convergence, a signal made real, and he added quietly that the implications of such a union were vast, not only genetic but symbolic, a joining of resonance fields that transcended known models of hybridization. And Eli looked at Kaelira and asked if she was all right with this, and her eyes were calm as she said, "I am not afraid, The alarms came in whispers, not sirens. The first transmission was intercepted in the upper orbit relay, A coded burst from a Virellian reconnaissance vessel trailing behind Jupiter's curve. Tarnoke had warned them. Hardy had scrambled communications and rerouted their beacon through mining relays on Europa, but it hadn't been enough. The child changed everything. The energy field Kaelira now carried was no longer faint, no longer uncertain. It had grown, luminous and distinct, a resonance that could not be hidden. And the Virellian authorities had noticed. They called it a biological anomaly, a potential threat to cross-species genetic integrity, a deviation from controlled evolution. They issued the order not as a declaration of war, but as an administrative directive. Retrieve the subject. Isolate the offspring. Analyze and neutralize if necessary. The words carried no blood, but the meaning was clear. Hardy brought the auric drift low into the thermal veil of Luna 3's southern hemisphere, using the geothermal flux to scramble long-range scans. He said nothing when Eli told him what they had decided. He simply nodded, tightened the harness around the pilot chair, and whispered something to the ship that Eli did not catch. In the quiet quarters below deck, Kaelira sat wrapped in a thermal cloak, her hands resting on the curve of her abdomen, her glow pulsing in soft concentric waves that lit the walls with subtle movement. She looked at Eli, and there was no fear in her expression, only a kind of fragile peace. "We cannot run forever," she said. He sat beside her. "I know. But I would. If you asked me to." She smiled faintly. "I won't. The child is part of both of us. But it is more than that. It is a pattern they cannot categorize. A possibility they are not prepared to witness." He nodded slowly. "Then we let them see." Hardy opened a channel to the outer network. A simple broadcast. Unencrypted. No threats. No resistance. Just a single visual, Kaelira standing in the observation deck, her body lit from within, the pulse of unborn life glowing through her skin like a constellation made of breath and memory. Beside her, Eli stood with one hand over her back, not speaking, not justifying, only being. The message was clear. This exists. We exist. And we are not afraid to be seen. The response was immediate. From the Virellians, silence. Then mobilization. From the human colonies along the mid-rim, confusion. Then questions. From the fringe outposts, where medicine came from black market ships and hybrids were not anomalies but neighbors, came a flicker of hope. Tarnoke forwarded private messages from physicians and scientists and exiles who had seen too many children labeled inefficient and discarded. Some wanted data. Others offered sanctuary. A few simply said thank you. In an asteroid orphanage on the belt, someone played the broadcast for children with mechanical implants and unregistered genomes, and one girl whispered, "They look like us." A resistance cell in the Persean drift downloaded the feed and encoded it into a sculpture of light, letting the image pulse in public silence above their hidden sanctuary. Even on a trade station near the outer edge of known space, a bartender paused mid-shift to stare at the flicker of Kaelira's form on an old, cracked holoscreen and muttered to no one, "Finally." The signal spread not like a war cry, but like a seed, small, quiet, stubborn, and something began to grow around it. The Virellians approached the Luna in formation. Not warships, but vessels of containment. They brought medical units, quarantine fields, neural suppression arrays. They came with solutions that had no place for beauty. Hardy stood at the bridge with his fingers over the throttle. "We have enough juice to break orbit and dive into the shadow corridor. They'll lose us for 3 hours. That's your window." Eli looked at Kaelira. She looked at the child she carried. And then she looked out the viewport. "No," she said. "We stay. We let them arrive. We let them witness." Eli nodded. Not because he agreed. But because he tr. They could have run forever, hidden, survived. But they didn't. Instead, they chose to be seen, to show the world that their child, their love, their light, was not an error in the system but a miracle the system could never predict. He was just a man. She was just a girl forgotten by a broken machine. But together, they created a resonance that rewrote what was possible. And in a cold galaxy governed by silence and rules, their small family dared to say, "We exist, we matter, and we are not afraid." Because sometimes, the most powerful revolution begins with a refusal to walk away.